It's Patrick Hutzel from IntensiveCareHotline.com, where we instantly improve the lives of families of critically ill patients in intensive care, so that you can have peace of mind, real power, real control, and so that you can influence decision making fast, even if you're not a doctor or a nurse in intensive care. This is another episode of Your Questions Answered, and in last week's episode I answered another question from one of our readers, and the question last week was: my mum has been in intensive care for 3 weeks now and she is on ECMO for ARDS. Will she survive? You can check out last week's question if you're clicking on the link below this video. Last week's question was also another part of a series of questions this reader Ellie had. You can check out previous questions of Ellie here if you're clicking on the links below this video. Ellie has also been featured in our podcast in an interview that you can check out again on the link below this video. In this week's episode of Your Questions Answered, I want to answer another question that we get quite frequently from quite a few readers that I think really needs to be addressed here. The question this week is: can you go home on a ventilator? After having worked with literally thousands of critically ill patients and their families in intensive care, in more than 15 years intensive care nursing in 3 different countries, I have come across numerous challenges that families of critically ill patients face in intensive care. One of the biggest challenges families of critically ill patients in intensive care experience is that when their loved one is critically ill and requires mechanical ventilation with tracheostomy, and therefore requires the ventilation with tracheostomy for longer than expected, that's when families realize that they have a big problem and a massive dilemma. Families of critically ill patients in intensive care who require ongoing mechanical ventilation with tracheostomy quickly realize that there is often no easy way out of this situation. They quickly realize that their loved one is stuck in intensive care on a ventilator and with literally no or very little quality of life. Families of critically ill patients who require ongoing mechanical ventilation with tracheostomy quickly realize that their loved one has no privacy, no dignity, no control, and is heavily dependent on other people. Families of critically ill patients in intensive care who require mechanical ventilation with tracheostomy also quickly realize that the intensive care team doesn't really have a recipe either on how to improve your critically ill loved one's situation or therefore their quality of life in intensive care. The fact of the matter is that intensive care is just not the right environment for your loved one who requires ongoing ventilation with tracheostomy. You and your critically ill loved one have very little or no say what your day looks like in intensive care, although the only thing, generally speaking, that keeps your loved one in intensive care is the ventilator dependency with tracheostomy. You, your family, and your critically ill loved one quickly realize that the intensive care team is calling the shots, so to speak, is driving the bus, and you quickly realize that you have no peace of mind, no control, no power, and no influence. You might have also realized that after your critically ill loved one might have gone through multiple failed weaning attempts off the ventilator, that your loved one gets depressed, apathetic, and is losing the will to live even, as the intensive care environment is just not the right environment. You would have also realized by now that you and your family are spending far too much time in ICU, and you and your family have realized that you are basically putting your life on hold whilst your loved one stays ventilated in intensive care. Therefore, many families of critically ill patients and the patients themselves, if they are awake and conscious when faced with this challenge in intensive care, ask the question: can you go home on a ventilator? It's a fantastic question to ask, and in short, the answer is yes. However, it depends on where you live and it depends on service availability. For example, if you are living in Australia, check out intensivecareathome.com.au, and if you are living in European countries such as Germany, Austria and Switzerland, there are plenty of specialized intensive home care nursing services for long-term mechanically ventilated adults and children with tracheostomy, and they provide specialized intensive home care services that provide your critically ill loved one with a much improved quality of life, because you and your family can stop spending day and night in intensive care. Those specialized intensive home care services also provide families of critically ill patients with a much improved quality of life, because you and your family can finally stop spending day and night in intensive care. Those specialized intensive home care services, besides providing a genuine alternative to a long-term stay in intensive care, also provide intensive care units with a much needed and much more efficient service compared to an expensive, inefficient and burdensome long-term stay in intensive care. In essence, intensive home care services such as intensivecareathome.com.au provide a win-win situation, and they create real value by taking long-term ventilated adults and children with tracheostomies out of intensive care and provide care for them at home on a 24-hour basis if needed, and have critical care trained nurses looking after them. Those services also improve the quality of life for long-term ventilated adults and children with tracheostomy, and as I mentioned before, they improve the quality of life for families of critically ill patients in intensive care, as they can finally stop spending day and night in intensive care. In some instances, they also improve the quality of end of life for long-term ventilated adults and children with tracheostomy. Intensive home care services free up expensive, precious and in-demand intensive care beds that can be used for other more acutely unwell patients in intensive care. Those services also give back control to patients and their families in their own environment, where families and patients can structure their days according to their needs and not according to the intensive care unit's needs. Those intensive home care nursing services also focus on opportunities and possibilities for long-term ventilated adults and children with tracheostomies. For example, taking ventilated children back to school, or focus on employment and education opportunities by having the right level of support in place. Imagine the alternative is a long-term stay in intensive care. Also, intensive home care services focus on spending quality time with their families in their own environment. The focus also lies on spending time on activities such as going out, getting some fresh air and focusing on patients' strengths and not their weaknesses. Intensive home care services also boost the morale, the energy, the self-worth, the self-confidence and the self-esteem of long-term ventilated adults and children with tracheostomy by taking them out of a depressing and inhibiting intensive care environment into their own home. And last but not least, intensive care home services create a more cost-effective and viable alternative for hospitals, health insurances and health funding agencies to provide an extension to their existing intensive care services. Again, check out intensivecareathome.com.au for more information. Now, I can also share that I have personally worked with many long-term ventilated adults and children with tracheostomies in their own home as a genuine alternative to a long-term stay in intensive care. And to me, it's a no-brainer. And it's the right thing and the only thing to do if someone is trapped in intensive care on a ventilator. The level of peace of mind, control, power and influence you, your family and your critically ill loved one will experience at home is just so much improved, not even mentioning your and your loved one's quality of life. In short, Yes, you can go home on a ventilator. It's not only the right thing to do, it's the only thing to do. So, how can you have peace of mind, control, power and influence whilst your loved one is critically ill in intensive care? You get to that all-important feeling of peace of mind, control, power and influence when you download your free Instant Impact Report now by entering your email below. In your free Instant Impact Report, you learn quickly how to get peace of mind, real power and real control, and how you can influence decision making fast whilst your loved one is critically ill in intensive care. Your free Instant Impact Report gives you in-depth insight that you must know whilst your loved one is critically ill or is even dying in intensive care. Sign up and download your free Instant Impact Report now by entering your email below. In your free Instant Impact Report, you learn how to speak the secret intensive care language so that the doctors and the nurses know straight away that you are an insider and that you know and understand what's really happening in intensive care. In your free report, you will also discover how to ask the doctors and the nurses the right questions, discover the many competing interests in intensive care and how your critically ill loved one's treatment may depend on those competing interests, how to eliminate fear, frustration, stress, struggle and vulnerability even if your loved one is dying. You get 5 killer tips and strategies helping you to get on the right path to peace of mind, control, power and influence in your situation. You will get real-world examples that you can easily adapt to your and your critically ill loved one's situation. How to stop being intimidated by the intensive care team and how you will be seen as equals. You'll get crucial behind-the-scenes insight so that you know and understand what's really happening in intensive care and how you need to manage doctors and nurses in intensive care. And it's not what you think. Thank you for tuning into this week's Your Questions Answered episode, and I'll see you again in another update next week. Make sure you also check out our blog section for more tips and strategies, or send me an email to support@intensivecarehotline.com with your questions. This is Patrick Hutzel from intensivecarehotline.com, and I'll see you again next week in another update.